Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us today. I'd like to ask you please to take a moment to answer the poll that I'm launching now. It's just 4 questions. It won't even take 10 seconds, I'm sure, if you just do it real quick. Okay, almost done. A couple more people. Okay. 4 more people. You know who you are. And if you don't want to take the poll, that's fine too. I'm going to give you 10 more seconds to complete it. And if you didn't, I'll figure you didn't want to. Okay, there we go. We're ending the poll there. Okay, thank you, folks. Okay. Okay, so I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Thomas Kingery. I'm the program coordinator for the Avenidas Rainbow Collective. I want to thank you all for joining us today in this training. I know that you're all very busy and I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to take part in this training. I also wanted to emphasize why this training is important, not only to you, but and to your agency, but to the older adults in the LGBTQ community. In Santa Clara County, there are literally thousands of LGBTQ older adults. Studies have shown that many LGBTQ plus adults go back into the closet when seeking care and or housing for fear of discrimination. By taking this training, you are taking your first steps in helping to make older adults in the LGBTQ plus community feel safe, included, and welcome as they navigate the challenges of aging. By taking this training, you are also taking the first steps in empowering yourself and your organizations, residencies, or practices to provide better and more inclusive services to the community at large. Today, we're happy to be working with OpenHouse San Francisco and Ephraim Getahun, who will be providing this training for you today. OpenHouse is an amazing organization that supports LGBTQ plus older adults in San Francisco by providing housing, direct services, and community programs. With a warm heart, I am proud to introduce to you right now, Ephraim Getahun.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for that introduction. Thank you to both you and Christina for inviting me. I mean, I really appreciate working with, any organization that, has demonstrated a commitment to continuing to support this very specific demographic of LGBTQ older adults. So I am just going to go ahead and jump right in. So I'm just going to let me set up here and share my screen. 1 second. Let me just make sure the sound, okay. Okay. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Good, perfect. Okay, yes, so welcome to the Open House LGBT Senior Center Cultural Humility Training. So I am, like Thomas had mentioned, my name is Ephraim Getahun. I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Training at Open House LGBT Senior Center. I've been there for going on 3 years, I believe. And this is one of many trainings that we offer at Open House. This is Cultural Humility, which is kind of our entry-level training that introduces a myriad of other menu options, really, of trainings, because we never really know where people are coming in from, right? Like everyone intersects with these communities from different places. For some people, this might be the first conversation around LGBTQ aging needs. For other people, you might be an expert. You've already graduated with your master's in these things, but it never hurts to continue learning and to revisit information, because that information is always changing. So welcome. I'm very happy to have y'all. Like Thomas had mentioned, at the end, there will be an opportunity for questions. Like Thomas had also said, I want to echo, please, I invite the discomfort and the uncomfortable questions. Leaning into discomfort is really important rather than avoiding it. And we'd rather kind of dissect whatever it is, whatever point of, I don't want to say ignorance, but like maybe not being aware or not having that understanding from the get-go. I would appreciate actually diving into that so we can hash that out here so that you can go out into the community and we're causing the least harm possible when we're engaging with our LGBTQ older adults. So some brief housekeeping. Why are we here? I just want to set some expectations for why we're here and the overall objective of this training. So keep in mind that we're about to cover an immense amount of information. You will not be quizzed on any of this info. It is actually impossible to cover all things LGBTQ in a few hours, right? In a couple hours that we have. So just take a deep breath, relax your muscles and your jaw. Just know that this is the very beginning. If you were to walk away today with 2 or 3 new ideas, then I have successfully offered a training. And this has been a successful 2 hours together. And just, have fun, minimize any distractions. You really want to try and pay attention, but, I understand that everyone is still at work. And so if you have to quickly handle an email or handle a call, I understand. So my name, again, is Ephraim. My pronouns are he, him. And, for some people, I know that Thomas had mentioned to include your pronouns in your name. For a lot of people, they may not be introducing themselves with their pronouns. That might be the first time you've heard someone announce their pronouns at the very beginning of an introduction. And we always want to move without assuming that what ends up happening is trans people always kind of have to out themselves. And so we want to level the playing field a little bit and always offer our own pronouns because it actually does 2 things. It signals an opportunity, an invitation for someone else to then be who they are, right? It signals like, hey, these are things that are important to me and I want to honor this other person that I'm engaging in. But it also stops the othering, right? Because the othering is where harm happens when trans people end up having to be the only people that have to out themselves. So in the very beginning, I just want us to think, and these are going to be rhetorical questions, about how much knowledge we have with these specific demographics. So, when it comes to the LGBTQ community, when I ask the following questions, I want you to think to yourselves how much or how often you have made a conscious effort to be connected to these communities. So obviously your work might bring you to a lot of older adults, but I want us to think more about connections in our personal lives, right? Because your work, you are paid every couple of weeks to show up and do your job. And we all do it really well. And we're all experts in what we do. But there is a paycheck there. There's an incentive to show up and build these connections with specific communities. So in your personal life, how much do you have relationships with older adults? How much do you think about ageism in your daily life? How much do you know about LGBTQ people and their issues? And how much do you know about trans people and their issues? And again, this exercise is really just to understand how removed you likely might be from these communities. And if we are removed from these communities and don't have, authentic relationships in our personal lives with these communities, I want us to think about the stories that we start to make up about individuals that might be in these communities. Like what biases do form, right? And a bias, just for anyone that might not be familiar with that term, is just a story that you've essentially created. Sometimes they're based on stereotypes, but a story that you've essentially created about an entire demographic of people purely based on fiction, right? Like there might be some stereotypes, but sometimes stereotypes can be rooted in some truth. But at the end of the day, you actually have no true understanding of these individuals. And so that's why it's so vital to build these authentic, genuine relationships with folks that you may not traditionally build with. So very briefly, I just want to talk about what the heck Open House even is. An Open House is an organization that has been around for a little over 20 years, started mainly as a housing organization for LGBTQ older adults, but over the past 20 years has expanded to include many different services. So we have our Aging and Disability Resource Center. We have lunch and discussion groups to combat isolation, to promote socialization. We have case management. We have, of course, support groups, social groups. We have our friendly visitor program, which is a mirror from, programs all over the country that pair. It's like an intergenerational program that pairs youth with older adults, and those friendships then actually outgrow the program themselves. I think the oldest companionship that has developed is around 7 years. Then we also have our food insecurity intervention program, which was born out of COVID, because unfortunately we had we pretty much had an awakening, understanding that our seniors, our older adults, had woven together a schedule of programs from all of the nonprofit organizations in the city to get a hot meal. And it's really devastating because the hot meal is supposed to be an accessory, right, to the program, to build community and to engage and, to have some fun, because a hot meal is such a core center of community. But we don't want that to be a bribe to engage with our programs, right? Like people that are food insecure should not have to rely on the schedule of meals. So we've partnered with the Marin Food Bank and are delivering, I think, 75 bags of groceries every week to 75 individuals. And then we just opened our Open House Unlock Community Day Services, which is an adult day program. It opened a month and a half ago. And this adult day program serves individuals that are 55 years or older, anyone that might need support with ADLs. It's open Tuesday through Saturday. Right now on a half schedule, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. We offer transportation, LGBTQ centered activities, support with care, and it's on a sliding scale daily fee. So if you're making less than $20,999 a year, there is absolutely no cost to come and attend. So please connect with me if you have an individual that can benefit from this program. So today, some of the learning objectives. We are going to talk about the history and statistics surrounding the LGBTQ older adult community. It's really important because of the very unique experiences of older LGBTQ seniors. It is really vital to understand in context their experiences throughout time. We're going to cover LGBTQ basic terms and concepts. It's important to really dive into, really our gender exploration today is going to be very 101. Really, everyone here should commit to a lifetime of really unpacking what gender actually means. And you could insert whatever here, race, misogyny, you can insert whatever major topic, but it is a lifetime commitment to unpack the ways that we are perpetuating these systems every day. And then we'll talk about some best practices when engaging with the LGBTQ older adult community. So what the heck is culture of humility, right? I think a lot of the language has started to lean away from cultural sensitivity. We don't want to be sensitive more so than being humble, right? If I don't know much about Japanese culture, if I bought a plane ticket today to go to Japan, most Americans probably wouldn't think about this, and their ego does get in the way. And I think they aren't necessarily humble when entering into a lot of cultures. But if you want to engage with a culture, you want to enter in it with some humility. I don't know much about Japanese culture, so I'm going to study it. I'm going to learn about it before I go, maybe learn some, key phrases so I can go about communicating while I'm navigating some of the cities. And so that is what we're thinking about when we're talking about humility, and the same direction that you want to enter into negotiating with communities here in America that you may not be familiar with, whether that's you as a white person coming into a Black community, you as a straight cis person coming into a queer community, etc. Right? So what does that look like in practice? That looks like listening without judgment or assumptions. That's recognizing power dynamics, and that understanding that each person is the expert of their own experience, right? You as the listener right now are sitting at the center of your universe. Every which way that you look, you are the centerpiece, right? So there is no individual that can tell your story better than you can. So it is by building these authentic connections, listening to individual stories, that we actually have a genuine understanding of the struggles and what's the word? Like celebrations of any unique community. And so when we start thinking about cultural humility, there is a certain sense of presence that you have to embody, right? Because when you're engaging with a community you may not be familiar with, you being the centerpiece of your universe, right? Being the nucleus of your experience, it is very easy for you to kind of identify, define, and understand what is important to you, right? It's the easiest task out of the things I'm about to list here for you to understand after you've negotiated with your culture, with your language, with your spirituality, to sit there and understand what are the practices, cultural expectations, personal convictions that are important to me. But then in this presence, sensing what's important to the other person, now this is a harder ask, right? Sensing what is important to the other person can only be done through authentic, genuine connection. Because if you are the narrator of your own experience, that means every person you encounter is also the narrator of their own experience. So in order to understand what's important to the other person, you must forge true, and I can't say this enough, forging that true, authentic connection with the other person, listening to their stories, listening about their beliefs, listening about their cultural expectations, and kind of offering yourself in this humility to learn about this other individual. But then what's even more difficult, and where this usually stops, people can absolutely get through step one. Some people can get through step two, listening. Really, that's mainly the goal is just to listen. But then how do you blend those two things together, right? Because this is the hardest ask, only because many people believe that blending what's important to me or to you and blending what's important to the other person means compromising or sacrificing your own beliefs or convictions, which is simply not the case, right? It is no secret that many cultures have, many blocks when it comes to understanding and accepting the LGBTQ community. That may be religious communities, that might be cultural communities. I am Ethiopian. The Ethiopian community, especially back home, not only here in the States, finds the LGBTQ community repulsive. It's immoral and disgusting. If I were to walk down the streets of Ethiopia, especially even in Addis Ababa, the capital, as who I am, it wouldn't be uncommon for people to be murdered or imprisoned. So there are many, many, many unique perspectives with which people are coming from. And so what ends up happening is this belief that by recognizing this other individual, by honoring this other individual's identities, that we are somehow compromising our own beliefs or our own identity. And we really need to move away from that. Blending is the most important action when practicing cultural humility. So we're going to jump into history, some context. What is it about the lived experiences of the LGBTQ older adults that we're engaging with now? And all of everything, this goes for any individual, your entire understanding of the world and how you engage with it is based on many snapshots of history that make up who you are. Right. So it's really important to understand the general history of this community so we understand some of the ways that trauma might present, some of the ways that friction between different generations might present. So we're going to kind of jump in so we can set you up with that foundational understanding of this community's experience. San Francisco specifically is home to 20,000 LGBTQ elders that are ages 60 years old and older. I know Thomas just mentioned that there are thousands in the South Bay specifically, or maybe more specific to, I don't remember if you had said South Bay or if it was the city that y'all are in right now, but go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, I was going to say Santa Clara County is what I was referring to. And we actually did an LGBTQ older adult survey that just concluded. So I'm not allowed to reveal the results of the survey till November 17th, but I can say thousands were surveyed.
Great. Ooh, some juicy details. November 17th, everyone. I know everyone's on the edge of their seats. So it's really good. People are so bored with research, but it's so vital because that is literally how cities, states, countries decide to allocate and distribute money, which is the absolute core of how we are going to do and execute the mission in our work. So it's really great to hear that there's another study that's about to be released. So 20,000 LGBT seniors up here in San Francisco. And of course, in California happens to be one of the bigger hubs for LGBTQ older adults. That there's many reasons for that. So it's really vital to recognize, people assume that these communities don't exist. 1/3 of LGBTQ older adults live at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. This is extreme poverty. And when we consider that 33% of LGBTQ seniors are at or below 200% of the federal poverty line, we have to understand some of those compounding factors, right? This just doesn't happen just because LGBTQ older adults are lazy or unable to, be productive people in our society. There are massive systemic barriers that keep LGBTQ people in general, but also older adults from thriving. So employment discrimination. When we think about employment discrimination, we obviously know that that's already happening in present day. But if you're talking about a lifetime, I'm 31 years old now. 5 years ago, maybe 8, I don't know, when gay marriage was even legalized, I was alive. I can say that I was alive when gay marriage was legalized. And we can think about gay marriage as being like, oh, it's so beautiful that love can fruition and manifest in this way, and we can announce it in this way. But there are very legal benefits to marriage, right? So of course, it's important to think about queer folks being able to thrive because of these permissions. But I'm thinking about the legal, bureaucratic, systemic benefits from being able to get legally married to someone else, right? So if you were talking about a lifetime where an individual was kept from being able to be employed unless they closeted themselves, folks that get reduced social security payments because of their identities, limited access to their partner's benefits, specifically because they may not have been legally married yet or have gotten too old or their partner might have passed and they have not have been able to benefit from that. So there are many reasons, right? And then, of course, when you start to cascade down the LGBTQ identities, trans individuals are going to have experienced significant more barriers than their cis queer counterparts. Then when we consider LGBTQ seniors, one of the most astounding statistics is that 57% of queer seniors live alone. Compare that to, I think it was only 20, it's right here on the slide, only 25% of older adults in general having to live alone. So some of the reasons queer seniors end up alone in their old age are because of the following compounding factors: family estrangement. Many LGBTQ seniors are excommunicated because of who they are. This is not a new this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, I have friends alive today, myself included, that have been excommunicated from their families. So this is still a perpetuating cycle. And so obviously times were not nearly as accepting 50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago. So when you think about the queer adult as they are starting to come out, that family estrangement means for individuals that might have been able to benefit from generational wealth or might have been able to benefit from some kind of will when their family had passed, or if there was a house that could have been benefited. That is how wealth gets passed down from family to child and down through generations, right? So if an individual is now excommunicated, they no longer can benefit from whatever wealth might have been that they could have inherited. They're twice as likely to be single. They're 3 to 4 times less likely to have children. When we think about the traditional family structure, there's a man, a woman, that man and women get married, they have children, those children age, and as then their parents age, then those children become advocates and caregivers to their adult parents and advocate all the way through their death, right? And obviously not every family is necessarily quite as seamless as that example, but when it's very expensive to adopt children. It's extremely expensive if you're going to go through another process like IVF. So if you're already talking about a community that is in poverty, how in the world would they even afford to be able to build a family if that was something that they were interested in doing so? 34% of them have also experienced the death of a partner. Oftentimes, their partner ends up being the caregiver for their loved one. And then when that partner passes away, most of us that are excommunicated from our families, we've built chosen families, but our chosen family is also aging at the same time. So there's no way for older adults to be able to then not only care for themselves and advocate for themselves as they're becoming more vulnerable, but that chosen family, it has its limits because the traditional family structure would have those children to be able, in their youth and their sprightly energy, be able to advocate and care for their aging parents, right? So these are some considerations. And then, of course, we would be remiss not to mention trauma and how it affects the LGBTQ older adults. And LGBTQ seniors have experienced significant trauma. 82% of LGBTQ seniors have been victimized based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. We're going to go through a little bit of the context and history here shortly. But, again, there are very different experiences depending on where you sit on this LGBTQ umbrella, right? The trans experience is going to be significantly more traumatic in the older aging community than it would be for the cis experience. And even when we're talking about poverty, of course, at least if cis individuals chose to be closeted with it, which is still extremely damaging, it's extremely horrible, but at least there is the ability to hide if you needed to, right? Trans individuals may not have had that luxury, and so then would have to rely on other types of work, whether that's sex work, whether that's other types of work that ends up putting folks in danger, and then trauma that results from that work, where you're asking an individual to have to survive with really minimal tools, and then are then victimized, put in poverty, placed in poverty, and then also traumatized, and then wondering why it is that individuals are experiencing their lives the way they do as they age now. So some self-reflection, right? I want us to think about how our lives could be different if we ended transphobia, if we ended biphobia, if we ended homophobia. Because when we say, and let me just define what those words mean. When we say transphobia, I mean the fear and discrimination against transgender people. When I say biphobia, we mean the fear and discrimination against bisexual people or people that are attracted to more than one gender. And when we say homophobia, we mean the fear and discrimination against gay and lesbian people. So often we assume that these kinds of discrimination only affect queer people. But I want us to really just be creative in our imagination and expand further and reflect on how these kinds of discrimination can also limit our own experiences, especially if you're coming from the cis heterosexual experience. How has it cut you off from your truest self? How has it changed the way that you behave or cut you off from other people in your own life, right? And there's no need to answer. This is just a reflection point. And this can be done privately. I'm not asking for you to divulge in anything. But, how has transphobia limited your understanding of how you engage with your gender? There's so often I think when cis people, myself included, I'm sure in the past, when we're engaging with trans people and trying to, understand, especially when you're understanding transness for the first time, there is this burden placed on trans people of how frustrating or annoying it is that you have to think about this in a different way. But how grateful we should be to even consider gender in this new way, and then also be able to not only engage with a trans person and open our minds to understand and be imaginative to what gender even means, but then how freeing is that for yourself? And really, the more you start to unpack gender, the more confused you get about why it is that we're so excited to uphold the system and the way that we perform gender every day. Caution as you jump down the rabbit hole, but just go ahead. So we're going to go through a few generations, and these generations are the individuals that we care for every day. These are folks that are now considered older adults, right? And so we're going to start with the invisible generation. And when we think about LGBTQ history in the States, we have categorized these time periods, beginning with the invisible generation. And these LGBTQ seniors now are 90 years and older, actually almost would be 100, actually. So a lot of these folks, there's a very small group of these individuals left, frankly. But these are individuals that were born anywhere between the 1900s leading up to the 1920s. They're called the invisible generation, not because there was, that there weren't queer people, but because there was absolutely no public discussion about LGBTQ people and their issues. So being queer was taboo. It was even illegal. It could result in the death of LGBTQ people. Some of these people were some of the folks that are Some of the folks that are listed here, like Little Axe Broadnax, and he, for 3 decades, was a popular gospel singer. Julio Sario, who was an American political activist from San Francisco, who in 1961 became the first openly gay candidate for public office in the United States. There's Billie Holiday, who was a blues singer of the Harlem Renaissance, and many others, including Ma Rainey, Josephine Baker, Mobile Hampton. It's really a powerful history here. We have massive icons in the LGBTQ older aging community, many of them who are still alive today. I have the privilege of working with some folks who were at Compton Cafeteria and frequented often, which we'll talk about here briefly, shortly. But it's just really such a rich and diverse community of older adults that we experience every day. Next comes the silenced generation. These are LGBTQ people that are now somewhere in their 70s, 90s, up till their 90s, who were born between the 30s and 40s. This is a time where there was a loud and a public outcry against LGBTQ people. So they were called degenerate, they were called immoral, they were considered sex criminals. Trans and queer people were constantly victimized by other people and law enforcement specifically during this time. The queer community and police have had a very dissonant experience together. But, it was not safe to be open the way some queer people can be today. Some of the notable LGBTQ people of that time are Sir Lady Java in the very first photo there, who fought Rule 9 in 1967, which led to the legalization of cross-dressing a couple years later. It was not uncommon for police to stop trans people and make sure that they were wearing at least 2 articles of clothing that corresponded with their sex assigned at birth. So if they were perceived as a man, they had to be at least wearing 2 articles of clothing that corresponded with the gender that society was trying to push on them. So even though we call it cross-dressing then, it really just means clothing that affirmed this individual's gender, right? If they weren't wearing those 2 articles of clothing, they were designated, that were designated for men, they would be arrested and taken to jail. Then there's also Tamara Ching, who is an Asian American trans woman in San Francisco. She was also known as the godmother of Polk Street. She is an advocate for trans rights, HIV, and sex work related causes. There's Dorothy Allison, who's an American writer from South Carolina, whose writing focused on class struggles, sexual abuse, child abuse, feminism, lesbianism. So this LGBTQ generation experienced things like, and honestly started to leak into this next generation. They experienced the Great Depression. They experienced McCarthy trials, the Lavender Scare. And the Lavender Scare specifically was a really interesting time. It was essentially because homosexuality was considered a criminal behavior and a psychiatric disorder. This generation was subjected to torture. They were admitted into psychiatric wards. They were subjected to electroshock therapy. So, there's so many institutions of medicine, law enforcement that have been weaponized against this community. So oftentimes when now, older adults are beginning to engage, and we're going to talk about this shortly, when they're starting to engage with either law enforcement or medicine, there's a lot of mistrust. There's a lot of, and it's not just some historical notion that they're pulling from. They're pulling from lived experience, right? They're pulling from memory, and our memory is what protects us, right? That's how trauma shows up and then tries to protect you, even though you might not need that protection any longer, right? So it's really important to recognize the very specific experiences of this generation, the silence generation. Then comes the Pride generation. The Pride generation, these are LGBTQ people who are now somewhere between the 50s and 70s. And are the LGBTQ seniors who are beginning to age into home health and long-term care systems now. They were born between the 50s and 60s, and this was a time for tremendous social change. This was a time where the Stonewall riots and other civil rights movements were happening and becoming more visible. They brought LGBTQ rights and needs to the front of the movement. They increased visibility, paved the way for modern LGBTQ movements. This was also the time that homosexuality was decriminalized and no longer considered a psychiatric disorder. That does not mean just because medicine and psychology recognized that this wasn't, any longer a disorder. Obviously, society always is playing a role of catch up, right? So there was still considerable stigma, that still existed culturally and in institutions, but it is, we have to start somewhere, essentially. And these are people that the reason why I can walk down the street as comfortably as I can in San Francisco, although there's still experiences that are not, favorable, but the reason is because of this generation and the generations that came before them. And these are the shoulders that we continue to stand on. There is a really peculiar phenomenon in America when it comes to our elderly. It's something I was born in the States, so it's not like I'm, confused about the way this culture is, but that's one thing I do not understand. Our Ethiopian culture really has a high reverence for our aging population, for our elders. Most Eastern cultures also revere their elders. There's something very peculiar in Western cultures, not only about aging, but dying. There's something about putting it in a corner where we don't have to look at it anymore. And so that also perpetuates, and we're going to talk about ageism, because all of these things come to an intersection, right? That then perpetuate systems that really make these generations that have fought so hard for me to exist and make them invisible, which is really, really violent. So these individuals include Helen Zia, who is a Detroit a journalist and advocate from Detroit. Lou Sullivan, who was an American author and activist who's known for his work on behalf of trans men. He was perhaps the first transgender man to publicly identify as gay and is largely responsible for the modern understanding of how sexual orientation and gender identity are distinct, unrelated concepts. It's something that I think people have a hard time wrapping their mind around, how gender identity is completely separate from sexual orientation. And trust me, we're going to dive into it a little bit later. So this is the Pride generation. I would be remiss not to mention the Compton cafeteria riots. So often we put a huge emphasis on the Stonewall riots, which happened in New York City in 1969. But the Compton cafeteria riots are the first recorded, essentially LGBTQ protest, specifically led by trans individuals here in San Francisco. The Compton cafeteria was in the Tenderloin, and happened in 1966, so 3 years prior to the Stonewall riots in 1969. So every year when we're celebrating Pride, we're actually celebrating the Stonewall riots. I know we make it a huge party now, but it was a massive protest, massive fight for individuals' rights. It's great that we can celebrate, but we shouldn't miss it and forget that it was a protest, right? It's a riot. It's a point of contention. And so Compton cafeteria riots, these were trans women that were often frequented this space, and it was not uncommon for police to come and harass queer individuals, especially during nightlife. And so this was just one night where police were coming to harass the trans women that were having, it was late at night, I think it was like 2 or 3 in the morning, that came to harass these individuals, and they just had enough. They just had enough that night, and it just ended up becoming a riot. And so the Compton cafeteria riots is really the very first recorded protest in American history. This is very American-centric, the history that I'm providing, because queer history is as old as human history. And of course, when it comes to the LGBTQ older aging community, it's really important to touch on the AIDS epidemic. I used to facilitate the gay men's support group here at Open House. And one of the individuals was just talking about his experience during this and all of the loss that he had to endure. And, he was just to paint the picture, because I was the only young person in the room. And to paint the picture, he was like, just invite 100 of your most loved friends and family, and then take 80 of them and just wipe them out. Right? That was his experience of loss during this epidemic. And we see this current pandemic that's happening, and we saw how quickly there was a response when a huge population, the entire population of this planet is at risk of this virus, right? Within a year and a half, there was or maybe not even a year and a half, within a year, there was an intervention introduced, there were vaccines rolled out. And so think about then applying this logic to when HIV started to present itself. HIV was an epidemic that was left without an intervention for 14 years. Just imagine COVID. I know the States kind of did let this happen, but just imagine letting a virus go unchecked for 14 years, this pandemic, and think about the massive loss. We lost in this country 750,000 people. Imagine if we hadn't done anything. at all to intervene when this virus had ravaged the states. So in that same way, because of all of and this again is why prejudice is so important to name and recognize, because that is what directly informed the way the governments and policies decided to move when it came to how HIV was going to be treated and intervened, right? It wasn't until it started to spread and start to actually infect people, because it was assumed as soon as it came that this was an answer from God to wipe out gay people, right? It's like, thank God, this is something that, God is dealing with it. It is because of their sin that this is now here. So let them be eradicated, essentially. And so you'll look here at 1981 was the first recorded case of HIV infection. And you'll see that red line is the increase and continues to increase. I mean, this chart ends in 2007, but HIV infections continue to increase. That there are, it has definitely slowed, but we are still on an upward trend. But you'll notice then the blue line, which is parallel to that, is the deaths that resulted as HIV becomes AIDS, and then whether it's because of the disease itself or other infections that might take someone out. You'll see that vertical line is the very first intervention that was introduced in 1995. And you see the dramatic decline in deaths. And that continues to decline. Right today, an HIV infection today is no longer a death sentence. There are individuals that have HIV, that take their antiretroviral medication, that are essentially undetectable, which means that their virus load is so low that the blood samples cannot detect it, and it's virtually impossible to infect someone else. So it is because of the biases that formed against these communities that then directly informed how our government was going to address the issues, which then led to unnecessarily countless lives that were lost. And there's a huge emphasis on cis gay men during this time, but cis gay men, to some degree, at least in San Francisco, were receiving some medical care. Think about trans women. There were trans women that were literally dying in the streets that were not being cared for, because not only, obviously, there's already compounding discrimination against queer communities in general, but cis men were at least experiencing some a level up in comparison to trans women who were not receiving any care at all. So there, again, all of our intersecting identities afford very different experiences. And so that's just something to think about. And this quote is really, really powerful. It was like living through a war. And so that's why we talk about intersectionality. That's why it's so important to recognize all of the uniqueness that we all embody. For example, I am Black, I'm a first generation American, I'm queer, I'm cisgender. These identities are important because it is at that intersection of identities that we need to kind of pull from when we're thinking about the liberation of queer people. That's why so often, even when I think about the Black Lives Matter movement that happened last summer, but, the liberation of Black individuals, the liberation of queer individuals, the liberation of insert identity that is experiencing oppression here, it is always going to fail unless we pull up from the deepest intersections. And when I think about that deepest intersection, it is Black, trans, women, right? If we are not navigating this from an inclusive perspective and pulling them up, then it is by pulling them up that literally everyone else gets to benefit. Everyone will naturally benefit if we will just stop telling people to wait. Stop telling people it's not your turn yet, right? So the way civil rights continues to move, it always is inching forward, but it's always moving backwards as well. And it's a constant tug of war as we're trying to fight for the liberation of all people. So intersectionality is vital because no individual is a single issue person. You are a complex myriad of identities that make up who you are. And so we shouldn't just, you can't just fight for gay rights. You can't just fight for trans rights. You can't just fight for Black rights. You have to go to those deepest intersections to actually seek the liberation of individuals, of all people. So I'm going to play a short video. This video is going to move into my next point, which is really about the experience of LGBTQ older adults as they start to navigate aging services, right? Thomas alluded to this point at the very beginning, where now, of course, these LGBTQ icons, right, of our history have navigated immense oppression, have navigated immense trauma, immense poverty, and now are becoming or entering into a place of vulnerability as they're aging, because that's what aging does to us, right? And so what is the experiences of our older adults as they start to engage with long-term care facilities, home health agencies, aging services, right? These are really important questions. And so I'm going to go ahead and play this short video. It's about 3 minutes long.
A lot of people believe that you just live happily ever after, and that just is a myth.
People like ourselves, older, are hiding in nursing homes or whatever because they are scared to death.
It's incredibly common to go back into the closet again.
You just know when they don't want you there.
We've heard about homemakers going in, taking out a Bible and having the elder pray and asking for forgiveness.
And to be cured. It's not too late for you to be cured of this. They go back in the closet. She might mistreat me or abuse me.
They're so afraid of it, they are resisting any kind of medical attention.
That person was in their mid-20s during the McCarthy era.
The closet was the norm.
They could lose their job, they could lose, families.
We were sick.
Just
we were
sick
We were
people.
considered sick.
People were involuntarily hospitalized in psychiatric facilities.
Even electroshock.
The degradation of these people is so complete that their sex satisfaction comes only in being tortured themselves.
I was on the route to the nut farm.
So there's a real distrust of mainstream institutions.
I would never put myself in danger.
He became much more fearful of people knowing that he was gay.
You're not leaving now, are you?
Not right now.
LGBT elders are more likely than the general population to age alone because many gay elders never had children, have not had great relationships with their families of origin. There would be a higher degree of sort of alienation and isolation.
My family was the reason I existed, and I lost them all. If they ever choose to catch up before I die, I welcome them.
LGBT aging issues are an epidemic.
There's a small and growing group of us.
We're trying to go into the existing network so they become more inclusive. One of the most common lines we get is like, we don't have any gay elders here.
If I wasn't the only person responsible for Alexander, I would have ended my life.
This is our life.
Good to see ya! Hi! We'll be there in a few years.
I built this house in paradise. Oh, with a new step every day. We have a whole generation of people who don't know who we are. That's really sad, because you're missing out on a lot. We know a lot. We did a lot for you. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for us.
Look at how scrawny they are. Too bad I don't have an open casket.
Well, there'll be no open casket. There won't be anything, right?
If we are saying come out and be filled with pride, it's our responsibility to make sure that continues right through their last day.
Okay, so that illustrates a really devastating trend that we're noticing in aging services, specifically for LGBTQ older adults, where it's one thing that this society has already designed a path of trauma, of persecution for who these individuals are, but all of that ends up into an aging experience where in order to engage with healthcare, in order to get the care that you deserve, individuals are closeting themselves, right? And when I first came to this understanding, when I had first learned about this, I actually had a little bit of a breakdown because it brought up so much from myself individually. Like, I have experienced a lot of loss. I didn't come out until I was 25. So I'm 31 now. So that was 6 years ago. And that is directly because of not only the Ethiopian cultural expectations. My dad's a pastor. There's this religious fold on top of that. And so I made a decision to sacrifice connections with that in order to be who I am, right? Because I was entering into a place of this is going to be life or death for me individually. So it's one thing. I had come to that decision because it's worth it. I am living my best life now, right? It is worth that loss. But for me to think about eventually one day needing to engage with a long-term care facility or in healthcare, and I don't have someone to advocate for myself, and to then closet myself, it's like, what is the point? What is the point of all the loss? What is the point of all the suffering and the pain for me to just have to lose all of my dignity, all of my opportunity to actually thrive in my aging experience, to just closet myself so that I can be safe when I'm going to my doctor or if I'm in a nursing home. And so this is a really devastating realization. And you noticed how that individual and the gentleman had said that now the general practice is to really go into nursing homes and go into these healthcare agencies and provide trainings just like this one to bring people up to speed with the fact that there are closeted individuals in their census. And it is vital that we actually speak about being inclusive and show that inclusivity so that people can be themselves. And so, really the goal is to metastasize our gayness into everything that we do, because those individuals exist everywhere. It is foolish to assume. What did the individual say? He said, it's not uncommon to hear, oh, we don't have any gay elders here. That's absolute, I call it BS. Especially here in California in the Bay, where we live. Absolutely, that's incorrect. And so we have to demonstrate not only in our individual connections with these seniors as we're providing care. Of course, we individually can do plenty to provide, to learn and to actually be able to engage authentically with LGBTQ older adults and to signal that we're safe and a safe place. But there's systemic things as organizations that we need to really advertise, essentially, in order to actually, to break down that barrier so that older adults don't feel isolated and don't feel like that they have to closet themselves. So to touch again, some of those concerns when seeking care, right? There's a fear of losing independence and therefore their self-determination. And really, this is not just a queer experience. Prior to this role at Open House, I'm coming from a clinical lens. I'm a nurse. And so my nursing experience was all dementia and hospice. That's all I've only ever worked with in geriatrics. It's just kind of, I actually don't even know what influenced it. I think my first job was a CNA when I was 18, and then I just went to nursing school from there. And that's kind of where I've gone. So this is not, unique to the queer community, that all aging adults fear this experience of losing their independence. That's why going into a nursing home is such a fight for any individual. But then, of course, for the queer community, there's a fear of harm, discrimination, or inadequate treatment for being queer. And then a fear of being dehumanized and humiliated because of the structural oppression, because of the systems that we have in place. So we want to think about that fear of harm, because whether you are actually perpetuating that harm physically to these individuals, or if it's perceived, the result is the same, right? Like whether you actually have a violent staff member who's actually abusing someone because they're queer, or the perception that someone might actually harm me because I'm queer, both result in me not being honest about the care that I need, not being honest about the medical treatment that I need, not being compliant to my medical plans because I'm afraid, whether it's perceived or whether it's actually happening, right? So you're talking about, it's already, that perception already exists, especially when I think about my trans siblings as they're engaging with Kaiser or whatever healthcare network as they're trying to get their gender affirming procedures. There's still so much ignorance in the healthcare field around how to serve trans individuals. I have friends that go to their doctor, a new doctor, and the doctor's like, I've never had a trans patient. I mean, what if I can't even imagine as a Black person if a doctor said that to me. I've never had a Black patient. I'm a human being. Just treat me just like you would any other individual. There is obviously indications specific to trans people, but there are indications specific to a cancer patient, indications specific to someone who's diabetic. And what does that mean? That you just need to be educated and go about getting that education, because that is what you need to do as a doctor, right? So there's so many things that we're ignorant about that we engage with trans people specifically about, and we just think it's totally okay and normal to just be ignorant. And that's just not okay. So and then, of course, the fear of being dehumanized or humiliated because of structural oppression. If there are, on your intake paperwork, if you're assuming that these two women are siblings and sisters rather than partners, it's really dehumanizing and totally invalidating of their relationship and their partnership to make these assumptions. And those are structural assumptions. Those are built into our intake paperwork, into the way we engage with people, our assumptions. And so these are all things that we need to consider. And then again, when we think about intersections, right, that was in general for queer folks, but then of course, Black and Latinx folks have different experiences, and this chart breaks that down. I'm actually building out these trainings because after this past year, I realized how much we're missing when it comes from the Asian perspective, and really so many different other identities. And that's, we own that in being a little not recognizing that we were missing that in the first place. But when we think about, and this survey that was issued asked a very specific question. It said, as you get older, how concerned are you that the quality of care you receive by healthcare professionals and staff will be adversely impacted based on either your race or ethnicity and or your sexual orientation? So when you look at the answers, people that said very or somewhat concerned specifically said that their race, Black individuals said that their race was something that they were more concerned about than their sexual orientation. And that's obvious, I think. When I walk into a room, the first thing people see are my skin. Then they might then start to be like, oh, why does he have a weird headscarf on? And why does he have his nails painted, right? Then they might be like, okay, then there's also this other pack. But the first thing people see when I walk into a room is my skin color. And so usually when I'm engaging with systems, that is the first thing I'm kind of in the back of my mind. I'm like, is my Blackness going to have something to do with the way that I'm going to experience, what is my experience going to be like because of my Blackness? Then Latinx folks, they were more concerned about their sexual orientation more so than their race, but there was still 27% that said that their race was something of an impacting factor. But then, of course, white individuals, specifically their sexual orientation, was something of a much greater concern than their race. I think that's probably a pretty obvious reason. And then for folks that said very or extremely concerned about having adequate family or social support to rely on as they age, Black individuals were at 56% that answered that they were very or extremely concerned. Latinx folks were at 49% and white folks at 39%. And then for being concerned about abuse in long-term care facilities, again, Black folks at 37%, Latinx folks at 25%, and white folks at 19%. So again, this is why it's really important to understand all of the different identities and where they intersect, because it illustrates a different experience based on how many of those intersections, how many of those identities cross paths. So what are some things that we can do as an institution? And these things seem so silly, but it's so important, right? Because some of the negative things that take away, if the intake paperwork only have indications for individuals who are married, right? There's a huge assumption there. There are partnerships that are lifelong, that are longer than a lot of these heterosexual marriages have been, but have not been recognized until 2009, 2010. I don't even know when it was, when the Obama administration had legalized gay marriage. But that was a few years ago, really, several years ago. So it completely invalidates a lifetime commitment that many partners have had with each other. Assuming blood relation between individuals, that someone might be their daughter or mother, when they're chosen family, right? That there's something very unique about the queer community that we've been able to survive because we built our own families, because our bio families tend, not always, there are many affirming families. I don't want to always make it about, just this, crap talking about heterosexual families not being able to accept their queer children. But we build our own families. We're resilient that way. And these chosen families, then there's always an assumption about blood relation. Or because they're not blood related, now all of a sudden when someone's dying, we can't advocate for them. There are all of these systems in place that keep us from actually being able to show up for our chosen family, right? And then things like gendered bathrooms, where individuals who are trans have to choose between being persecuted in one bathroom and experiencing, mental anguish by going into another bathroom, right? It's like, which one am I going to choose here? Am I just so there's a lot there to be considered. But then positive things, of course, rainbow flags, trans flags, these things are really easy but important identifiers. Like if I walk into a space and I see a queer flag hanging, I'm like, I don't always assume that they're the most inclusive, but it's a signal. It means something that they have this flag represented up there, right? When an individual asks for their pronouns and more importantly, presents their own when they're making introductions, right? If I'm saying, hey, my name's Ephraim, my pronouns are he, him, boom, that already signals to a potentially trans person across the table from me that, hey, it's safe. If you want to come out, you can come out. I'm going to honor who you are, right? Gender neutral bathrooms that allow people to be able to not have to experience dysphoria when they're accessing something as fundamental as needing to empty their bladder, right? Having LGBTQ staff present, actually visible on your staff, but then again in your community. So that's kind of like chicken or egg, right? It's like, if you have staff that are represented, then that will only better inform the clientele and the types of clientele that you'll engage with. When a queer person comes in, you may not even know that they're queer, right? We can't just assume just because you're looking at someone, whether they're queer or not. When they see visibly themselves represented in the staff, they're going to be much more likely to engage with your programs, to engage with your healthcare plan, and be compliant to it. Show up, be out, which then will only encourage other clients to also be out. So it's really just like, it's kind of a domino effect that develops there. And then a warm and welcoming atmosphere, which these, I don't know, it's simple, but it's also, you can't teach these things. It's just be a human, like be soft, be warm, be, connect with these individuals. I don't know. I don't know how to teach that. That's just tap into yourself, I guess, and then hopefully you're able to connect with other individuals. Now, it's really important to dive a little bit deeper, right? Because the experiences of the LGBTQ Asian community, of course, a lot of their trauma and a lot of their the persecution comes from the identities they embody on that LGBTQ umbrella. But ageism is just as prevalent and just as violent. And really, this is for anyone who is an older adult. And I'm younger, so I'm really just experiencing, I'm speaking from theory, but I'm also speaking from my dual experience of being Ethiopian and witnessing how that culture experiences older adults and then how this culture experiences older adults. And so when we think about ageism, I want to define what that is. And it's the devaluation of older adults based on stereotypes, right? That they are not valuable, that they don't have anything to contribute. And ageism is extremely violent, right? Because the queer community has a really, really, really bad habit with being ageist and making older queer people invisible in our communities. There's many reasons for that. I'm sure the AIDS epidemic did not help when there's an entire generation of people that were missing that could have, provided that wisdom and knowledge and shared and connection. But this society specifically really does not like older people. It is designed to, even when I think about medicine, so much about medicine is specifically for cis, white, straight men. That is what it's designed for. And so when you start to age and you're not able to keep up with what the standard of a healthy individual is, we assume that individual is failing when actually healthcare is failing. Why isn't healthcare adapting to the needs of older people? Because again, healthcare, all of these systems are also ageist. And I would challenge you to take it a little bit of a step further, because I want us to think about what our lives would be like if our society valued aging and older people more. Because you know what? Myself included, we are all potentially, knock on wood, going to become old. Assuming that you live a successful life. I don't know. I don't want anything bad to happen to anyone in this room, but anything early at least. But potentially we're all going to become old people. And so whether you like it or not, you're going to be on the receiving end of what ageism looks like. And we can talk about it in theory, but the regular isolation, regular dismissiveness, making invisible of this entire aging community is extremely violent. And I want to eradicate ageism, not only for the older adults that are experiencing it today, but I don't want to experience it. I don't want to be made invisible. I want to be valued. I want my experiences to be heard and to be considered. And I want to be able to contribute in my old age. And so even even if you're one of those individuals that just empathy is something difficult to draw on, make it a selfish thing. Make it about you. Make it about, let's eradicate ageism because I want to be an old person that is seen and recognized and valued, right? So ageism is extremely violent. And again, another intersection, right? Like you can be a trans person, you can be Black, you can be a woman, and you can be old. And so all of those things make up the identity that then compounds to the experiences that we have, right? So ageism is extremely violent. Can't repeat that enough. So let's jump in to gender and sexual orientation 101. This is fun. I actually really enjoy this part. And really, we as aging services, as healthcare organizations are so ignorant on what to do. What are the best practices? How do we support these communities? Because how do we get to that knowledge? Research, data collection, which all costs money, which all means that we have to have a desire to even explore these topics. So for example, this individual, this quote is from a 51-year-old trans participant. And he says, I am over 50. I'm a trans health activist, and I'm afraid that my insistence on being who I am confuses people. I'm afraid of dementia and Alzheimer's. What if I, quote unquote, go back to my 10 or 20-year-old self as a girl or a woman? And I mean, when I read that quote, I was like, I don't know. What do we do for a trans person who has dementia, who reverts back to a person who they were when they were 15 years old and looks down at their bodies and confused as to why it looks the way it does when that's not how it looked when they were 15, right? We don't have best practices built out for that because no one's studying this stuff. Well, I shouldn't say no one, but there's such a limited motivation to study these things. And so that's why it's so vital to continue these conversations and put them to the front so that we can actually get the studies and the research and the data. And that's why SOGI collection, which I know is common practice now, collecting sexual orientation and gender identity, is so important, not only because we want to be inclusive to the people that we're bringing in, but that data, there's very specific markers about who these individuals are, how they're accessing these resources, who's not getting these resources. And if we're not collecting that data, then we're just blind. We're just moving about trying to fix the problem without any real tools to do so. So first things first, the gender binary. Dun, dun, dun. The gender binary is a very silly thing, but it's the way all of society decides to maneuver when it comes to who we are as individuals. And it happens as soon as we are born. And the assumption is that there are two shiny boxes and they're based on the organ that you're born with. So when a baby is born and brought into this earth, the doctor will look at this baby's body and be like, oh, that baby has a penis, M, on their birth certificate. And immediately from that male being assigned on to their birth certificate, there is a domino effect of assumptions that are made about this person's life all the way through their dying experience. We assume that because this baby was born with a penis, that baby will grow up to be a boy. We assume that boy will become a man. We assume that man should be masculine and that masculine man should be attracted to women. And then on the flip side, if a baby is born with a vagina, then there's an F that's assigned on to their birth certificate. We assume that baby with a vagina will become a girl. That girl will become a woman. We assume that woman should be feminine. And that feminine women should be attracted to men. These are all of the assumptions that are made. And so it's very silly, really, the more you start to think on it, how ridiculous it is that we assume that there are these two shiny boxes, right? Because if there's anything, there's enough shiny boxes for every individual person that's ever, that is alive today, that has ever existed, and enough shiny boxes for every person that will exist, right? If there are even boxes. And it actually invalidates an entire group of people that identify as intersex, which is a very biological, we'll get into that. Actually, I'm jumping a little bit ahead. And it's really powerful to assume all of these things purely based on the organ that someone is born with, because we know that someone's body does not determine their gender. This is a trans man. This is a trans man who's actually pregnant, right? So the body of someone does not identify their gender, does not mean, or who we love. There's all of these assumptions that because that baby was born with a penis, that it would grow up to be a boy and then a man, that man should be attracted to women. But we already know that a lot of us deviate from that plan. I deviated from that plan. So we know already that my body did not define accurately who I was going to fall in love with. women are not always feminine. And even remove outside of the queer community, there are plenty of straight cis women that are not, the most feminine presenting. They do not like makeup or all of these things that we've assigned as feminine anyway, which aren't inherently feminine. But, there's a lot about, womanhood is not just this all pink, nails done, purse, womanhood is extremely complex. And so it goes back to this idea of these two shiny boxes. Nothing about the human experience is nice and neat and in a box. My spirituality, my experience as being Black, as being first generation, humanity in its nature is not black and white. It is extremely complex, nuanced, right? So why wouldn't if my spirituality can be nuanced and complex, if my my experience as a first generation American, as being Black, can all be with nuance and complex, why wouldn't my sexual orientation or my gender identity also have nuance and be complex, much more complex than how we've defined it? In addition, men aren't always masculine. And so it's really important to then, as we examine this binary and what we assume, it's really important to let's define what the heck is even in the LGBTQ umbrella, right? So for this point, some of you guys are gonna be like, okay, I already know this, sis, but it doesn't hurt. Let's just jump through all of the terms that correspond in the LGBTQ umbrella. So I've tried to break these apart between sexualities and gender identities, but there are some caveats here, and I'm going to identify those caveats. Okay. So very quickly, this isn't the most important part of the presentation, but I do want to define these things, and I will provide forms maybe at the end of this presentation where I can provide them to Thomas so that these can be distributed, just so you have the glossary terms of these identities, because there's so many, right? I think some especially straight cis people might just be like, oh my God, I don't know. There's always there's an additional alphabet. I don't, letter in this alphabet, I can't keep up. So let's go ahead through these terms. So any lesbian person is any woman who's attracted to other women. Remember, remove gender identity out of this. This is purely based on sexual orientation. So this could look like a cis woman being attracted to another cis woman. This could be a trans woman attracted to a cis woman. This could be two trans women attracted to each other. So lesbianism is any woman who's attracted to another woman. A gay individual is any man who's attracted to other men. Same logic applies, right? This could be two cis men. This could be a cis man and a trans man. This could be two trans men. There's many different combinations from the gender perspective. But gay can also be a kind of an umbrella term. Really, lesbian women sometimes will refer to each other as gay as well. It's a pretty, it's really any same gender loving person. Bisexuality, I think there's been some long-term confusion around this word. Bisexual has been assumed to mean that anyone who's attracted to men and women, but the fact is bisexuality is really being attracted to more than one gender. As we explore gender, we understand that there are absolutely more than two genders, and so you could be attracted to a non-binary person and cis men. You could be attracted to cis men and trans men, cis men and trans women. There are many different combinations of genders that you could be attracted to. So bisexuality just means to be attracted to more than one gender. Queer is a massive umbrella term that really encompasses lots of sexual orientation and gender identities. I also usually like to include a political stance to queerness. I don't think queer is just about, loving same gender people, or even just having a gender identity that doesn't align with your sex assigned at birth. It is a very political stance. Really, queerness is about not only that you deviate from what society has designated because of the organs that you were born with, but it outlines or illustrates the resilience that you have to embody in order to stand against what society wants to force you to be, right? So queerness is very political, but it's a very huge umbrella term. And there's an asterisk there for a reason, because there's an aging community that the word queer was an extreme slur, right? There's probably folks in their 50s right now hearing me say queer over and over again. They're like, oh my God, if you say queer one more time. And so this is just, this is a term that's been, Thomas is like me. And that is so fair. That is absolutely, it makes perfect sense to me, because queer is was such a violent word used against this community. And then there are younger folks that have now reclaimed it, right? It's very similar to how the N-word is being reclaimed by Black individuals every day. And so but my, grandmas, Black grandmas on the street will absolutely slap you in the mouth if you say the N-word. So it's like, it's just this generational experience. And so you want to be very careful when you're assuming that it's okay to call an older adult queer. In fact, I would wait for them to self-identify as such before you label them as. Then there's asexuality. Asexual is a spectrum. People think it just means the absence of sexual interest in other people. Asexuality can be absolutely no interest or in sex with other individuals, but it can be a spectrum. So people can have little or no interest in having sex with other individuals. Or it can mean that sex is just not the centerpiece of what they consider when they're building romantic relationships. So again, asexuality, it's a spectrum. It's not black and white. Nothing is just black and white doesn't exist. Heterosexual just means we assume that the opposite gender attraction, this can be a cis man with a trans woman, this could be a cis man and a cis woman. So there's many, again, remember gender identity, sexual orientation, completely different things, right? But heterosexuality is essentially being attracted to the opposite gender. And then pansexual. Pansexual means that sexual orientation or gender identity of the other person play no role in your attraction to them. So really, you're just seeing the person, their gender identity, their sexual orientation. Obviously, consent is important. just because you're interested doesn't mean someone else is interested. But pansexuality just insinuates that their gender, their sexual orientation play no role in whether you're attracted to that person. Now, on the right side, we're going to kind of go through gender identities, but again, there's a couple caveats here. So transgender is a huge umbrella term, and that just means that anyone whose gender identity, their lived experience, their gender identity does not match the sex that they were assigned at birth. So the sex assigned at birth, there's really three options. There's male, female, and intersex, right? So, and we're going to cover intersex here shortly, but if you were assigned male at birth, but then as you aged and you're experiencing life, you recognize that you are actually a woman, that means you are transgender. Your gender identity does not align with the sex that you were assigned when you were born. Gender queer, gender non-binary can sit under the trans umbrella. For some gender non-binary people, it doesn't. It's like completely outside of it. But for the most part, gender queer, gender non-binary individuals might sit under the trans umbrella. And that specifically speaks to people that do not identify anywhere on that binary or are in between. So that could mean that they are completely outside of that binary. They do not identify as male or female. They don't identify as man or woman. These are sometimes people that use they, them pronouns, which we'll cover pronouns here shortly. So these are gender non-binary individuals. Or these are individuals that, today they woke up and they're like, you know what, today I'm Mark, please refer to me with he, him pronouns. And then tomorrow they might wake up and they're Sylvia and they use she, her pronouns, or they might use the same name, but their pronouns might change. And the way that their gender identity is experienced might shift from day to day, from hour to hour. And so again, that's this understanding that no one is just this fixed, static noise, right? Like we are complex, we are changing all the time. We're reflecting, examining, meeting and engaging with new people that we are mirroring each other all the time. Everything that you are is a mirror of every single individual you've ever experienced leading up to this very millisecond of me speaking to you right now and now. And again, now, right? So I don't even know why I'm saying that. But anyway, two-spirit individuals. Two-spirit is a very, I want to be very specific with this, where this is only for indigenous communities. And it really is synonymous with gender non-binary or gender queer individuals or third genders. But, gender non-binary and gender queer are colonized terms. These are, excuse me. It is, it's like, the Western world is catching up. I mean, third genders have been existing since the beginning of time. Even in Ethiopia, where being queer is illegal, there were the Ishmaelite people that were considered third gender or gender non-binary from thousands of years ago. There's records of these individuals existing. So colonization has a huge role in eradicating how queerness shows up in societies. And now, as we theorize about LGBTQ people, we're coming out with all these new terms that for for people that have always existed. And so from the indigenous perspective, it's like, I'm not going to use your colonized language when it comes to defining my gender. And so two-spirit is for specific indigenous communities. It would not be appropriate for someone who's not indigenous to use the term two-spirit. Then there's cisgender. And cisgender is the opposite of transgender in that your gender identity does align with the sex that you were assigned at birth. So, for example, I was born, and we're going to talk about this shortly, but if I was born and, my organs were looked at, they put male on my birth certificate, and then in my lived experience, I identify as a man, it doesn't cause any, dysphoria, it doesn't cause any discomfort or mental anguish for me to identify as a man, as the sex that I was assigned. I am cisgender. And for some people in the room, they're gonna be like, oh, that's just a normal person. You're talking about normal people. And that's really important that you thought that thought and then examine that thought, because that is exactly what we're trying to move away from, is the othering, right? You're not special and get to be the standard with which we measure everything. That's what, there's always the standard, right? There's the men are the standard, cis men are the standard, white is the standard, there's always the standard and then everything else. And that's what we're trying to move away from. There are cisgender people, there are transgender people, there are gender non-binary people, right? So it's just really important to have a name for what we would normally consider normal so that we can move from othering. Othering leads to bias, leads to prejudice, leads to violence. Then there's intersex. And intersex, some people might be familiar with that, or you might have heard that. There used to be really horrible slurs used for intersex people, like transvestite. That used to also be used for transgender people in the past. I've also heard, not transvestite, transsexual used to be used for transgender people in the past. What's unique is that I have trans seniors that I serve who still identify as transsexual. When I hear that, I'm like, oh shit, I don't even want to hear it. Which I imagine how, older folks feel when I'm saying queer, right? So it's like, that feels violent to hear transsexual, but that's who they were all of their lives. That's how they identified. So, however someone self-identifies, you just have to honor that. I would never call a trans person transsexual, and I do not condone, and nor do I encourage anyone in this room to call someone transsexual, but you might hear an older adult who is trans use that word. And so intersex is that word. Transvestite was the slur that was used for that. And intersex they are a myriad of biological conditions that an individual is born with. These are provable. It's not, this isn't like theory. This is someone's body was born with a combination of different kinds of gonads, organs, hormones. It's many different things can identify someone as intersex. And oftentimes, unfortunately, individuals may not know that they're intersex their entire lives. In fact, it ends up coming out during an autopsy, where you might find different organs than you assumed because of the outside, the exterior of the body and the way it looks. And what's really, really devastating is what intersex individuals have had to experience in the past, but still in modern day medicine, there are many doctors that will encourage parents to force surgeries on children to correct their gender, to force them into into these two shiny boxes. It's, we just think of these two shiny boxes as it's bad, but it actually causes real harm to individuals. There are people that as children are forced into surgeries to fix their bodies, and then later on in life realize, oh wait, I actually do identify as a woman, and all of my organs have been, ripped from me or surgically fixed or whatever the case is. And to be violated surgically in that way as children without any consent, it's extremely violent. So something to consider. And then there's a lot of terms. And then the LGBTQIA2S+, massive acronym. Just recognize that plus is there because we recognize that individuals will continue, because of the beautiful variety and fruits that humanity has to offer. It is endless, the possibility of identities that can exist. And while some people are like, oh my God, sis, I can't do another identity, it's like, be grateful for the opportunity to look at an individual and as you learn about them, to realize how creative creation is. It's not fixed. Creation's purpose is to beget more life. That is literally its purpose. And so how beautiful that we get to engage with individuals that challenge the systems that have robbed us of our own creativity. It has robbed us of our understanding of ourselves by then, perpetuating that the world exists in these two shiny boxes. So to further expand on what we were talking about, I want to use myself as an example to really put all of the terms and understanding of the queer, spectrum. Let me see where I'm at in time. Okay. So this queer spectrum, just to kind of really break it down, right? We talked about sex assigned at birth. So that's what the doctor said you were when you were born, based on the organs that you were born with. Your gender identity, which is how you feel, purely how you feel on the inside. Gender expression, which is then how do you present that gender? How do you present what you feel on the inside to others? And then sexual orientation, who are you attracted to, right? So let's break it down. When I was born, my doctor looked at me, pulled me out of my mother's womb and was like, oh, this child's a male. And my father was like, yes, my God, we get to carry the lineage of the Getahuns, what lineage? It's like, I always, when men are like, oh, you're the last of the line. I'm like, what are you even celebrating? Like, what line? Are you royalty? Like, otherwise I'm confused what we care about. But anyway, I was assigned male at birth. My father was ecstatic. Of course, he was like, oh, this child will grow up and he's going to become a pastor just like me and spread the word. I mean, I'm a different kind of preacher, but not the kind of preacher he expected me to be. But as I grew up, I lived my childhood as a boy. I was given all the things that perpetuate boyness and masculinity. And in my lived experience, I do identify as a man. I am cisgender. The more I think about gender, the more confused I am about it, but it doesn't cause me discomfort. It doesn't cause me, dysphoria or mental anguish to identify as such. I do identify as a man. But then my gender expression. Today, I'm not more on the feminine side. I love wearing makeup. These are inherently feminine things, but I love wearing makeup. I love wearing different kinds of clothing that would traditionally be identified for women. So sometimes I can be on the androgynous side, sometimes more on the masculine side, oftentimes more on the feminine side. So the way that the world sees and witnesses and engages with that gender is different than what people assume my gender identity should be expressed as, right? They assume I'm masculine, I'm tough, football. Let me not do that to cisheads. It's fine. It's fine if you love football. It's fine. It's all good. But, there's a lot of assumptions, toy trucks and I don't even know, so there are a lot of assumptions and I don't fit most of those assumptions of how a man should move through this world. Then my sexual orientation, who am I attracted to? Usually I'm attracted to more masculine presenting people. That does not mean just cis men. I'm attracted to trans men. I'm attracted to masculine presenting non-binary people. And really the more I think about sexual orientation, the more I've started to like, what am I? I don't even know. I wouldn't identify as gay anymore. Probably like, it's starting to enter into pan world, and how delicious of a buffet to just open everything up to just being connected to any human being if I feel so called. So these just really break it down in a really digestible way, right? And it's really important to name, right? Cisgender. I'm not normal. I'm cisgender, right? I just want to really identify that we need to move away from this normal language. The cis trans. So cisgender, transgender. So trans women and cis women will often use she, her pronouns. Trans men and cis men will often use he, him pronouns. And then gender queer, gender non-binary individuals may use they, them pronouns. They may use she, her pronouns. They might use he, him pronouns. You might see all pronouns. Really, as long as they're being used respectively, or respectfully, oftentimes some gender non-binary people don't really care what pronouns you use. They just don't even engage with the like being put into that box. And this is where some people, when they're negotiating with gender neutral pronouns, have a hard time. And I know that there's plenty of like little infographics on Instagram and social media that go around about using they, them pronouns. You use them all the time. You use it all the time when you don't know the gender of the person. For example, if I were to walk into Avenidas today and I accidentally left my phone behind when I left and the receptionist hadn't seen who had left it, that receptionist would pick up the phone and be like, oh my God, someone left their phone here. Let them know if they come that I have their phone and they can come and pick it up, right? I just used gender neutral pronouns there like 5 times. And it comes very natural because I don't have a vision of what that person's body looks like. It's when we see that person that all of a sudden we assume all of these things. We're like, oh, I see this body that should look like a woman's body. So immediately I assume that it's she, her pronouns, right? So we do that we actually very commonly use gender neutral pronouns. Is when we look at the person's body that we make all of these assumptions about who they are. So just lean into that part of when you do use gender neutral language actually quite often. And then that sensation that you feel as you're trying to I'm literally, when I pick up a phone and I don't know whose it is, I'm saying like, oh, they lost their phone. I just see like literally a shadow. I don't see a person's body, right? Almost try and like sit in that thinking when you're engaging with someone who you are looking at that identifies as gender non-binary. And remember, when I'm talking about these pronouns, pronouns are extremely important. It is life or death. It is suicide prevention for lots of trans individuals. And, I want us to really reflect on, right now, all I'm teaching you is behavior, like changing your behavior. I can't force myself into your brain to really examine gender in this much deeper way, right? That's a lifetime commitment to do. So even at this surface level, trans people know when you're using the correct pronouns, but still see them as a woman or as a man or, whatever the case might be. So I encourage you to really deep dive. I mean, this is nothing I can do can actually force this on you. This is a natural commitment you need to come to really unpack gender and its systems and the way that it shows up. But as you're getting there, you have to start somewhere, and that starts with changing your behavior by choosing to say the pronouns, even if in your brain you want to. You want to use she, her because you see their body, but they identify as he, him, or they, them because they're non-binary. It has to start somewhere. It has to start with that behavior, and not to alleviate the burden, not to alleviate the work that we need to do, but remember that you have lived a lifetime with a society that has fortified your understanding of what a body looks like and then the gender pronouns that are assigned with that. So recognize that you're not necessarily inherently a bad person. You're just, you're fighting against literally 30, 50 years, 70 years for some people of conditioning of how gender shows up for you, right? So just a thought to consider. So what do you do when you misgender someone, it's going to happen. It's always very funny. When I walk into an organization, sometimes they're like, oh, we'll never have that problem. Now that we've learned, we're never going to misgender something. Lie. You're lying through your teeth. You might not even know you're lying, but the harm is going to happen. You have to accept it. I think about the same thing when I think about diversity and equity. You're going to harm Black individuals. Get used to that idea, because now what that means is now we have to think about what is the system that we're going to create to support when that harm happens. How are we going to heal when that harm happens? So don't do if I misgender someone. When I misgender someone, what am I going to do? I'm going to tell you what not to do. And it's not to, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Oh my goodness. And just do this entire ridiculous performance of an apology, because what you're doing now, you've already harmed the individual. Now you're doing this performance because you feel like crap. You feel like crap because you just made this mistake. And now you have to perform this apology, which is yet a further burden on the individual you just harmed by making them be able to it's okay. How weird is it, right? You caused this harm and now you're making them say it's okay, right? Like this really bizarre thing when you really unpack it. So you need to, the harm happens, so you don't ignore it. That's really, really dangerous. You don't ignore it. You acknowledge it happened. You apologize, say, I'm sorry. But your apology actually is proven in your actions, right? Your apology will actually show up when you get their gender pronouns correct moving forward, right? And if you keep making mistakes, then there's a deeper dive. And I want us to move away from punitive. And I'm not talking for the trans people in the room. If there are trans folks in the room, I'm not saying you don't have a right to be angry. Be angry about that crap. That sucks. I'm not saying that at all. But from a structural perspective, from the organization's perspective, first, rather than going punitive with that individual who's getting it wrong, have a one-on-one, like real deep dive to understand what is the block. Engage with organizations like myself that offer trainings. We do one-on-one trainings, we do group trainings, et cetera, to be able to really educate folks, because obviously information is really powerful and important. And then you can move to other directions. We want to try and move away from punishment. For folks in the room, I don't know if everyone's abolish prisons. I'm not sure if everyone's really there. Everyone's different in their understanding of what what a society can look like in the future and what creative ways we can think. But if we really, for individuals that are committed to abolishing prisons, that means punitive measures, even in our interpersonal relationships, in our work, and which is a lot to unpack. I'm not going there at all. I'm just saying punitive doesn't quite necessarily get you the results that we need. It's about turning to wonder, turning and opening ourselves to try and understand where the other person's coming from, which, again, I'm not asking for Black folks to do the extra work. I'm not asking for trans folks to do that extra work. We, as cis individuals or white individuals in the room, or whatever the identity is, men in the room when it comes to women and non-binary individuals, because of the way the system is built in support of men, we all have our own work to do, and it's our own responsibility. So I didn't mean to go that far. No assumptions. Assuming is the worst. The assumptions is where actually everything else happens, because yet again, we had talked about how the assumptions were built based on the organs that you were born with. We still do them. And, gender reveal parties, they cause a lot of fires. There's that. But there's a lot of assumptions. And I know people want to celebrate these identities, but we are really, really, really focused on people's organs. And it's a little peculiar and worth examining. Why are we so obsessed with our organs and what's in our pants, right? So try not to make those assumptions, because those assumptions that were made when a child was born is what is causing all of the harm now. So instead, assume that a person might be transgender or cisgender or non-binary, that a person might go by they, them pronouns, or she, her pronouns, or he, him pronouns. Assume instead that a person might be lesbian or gay, bisexual, or straight. Who knew? Who knew that this person might be straight? I'm shocked. I'm honestly shocked every time I come in front of, when I meet a straight person, I'm like, it's not a unicorn. I'm just joking, but I am very much in the queer community that I kind of forget how diverse we are. And don't misgender. And specifically here, of course, the mistakes are really important to get in front of, but I'm talking about violent misgendering, which is the intentional invalidation, intentional harm by choosing to ignore the pronouns that someone has already identified for you, right? And then there's a little funny little quip here where when somebody calls you by your birth name or dead name, and it's just a little funny thing, but dead naming also is really, really violent. Dead naming is using the name that a person was assigned when they were born. Oftentimes for trans individuals, for binary trans individuals, for example, someone who might have been assigned female at birth but now identifies as a man, if you said, hey, Sarah, or whatever, like that's really, really violent. That person has chosen their name. It is really, really vital for their quality of life that we honor that. And it goes a step further, because there is misgendering or dead naming that can occur from a structural perspective, right? It's really difficult when you're navigating someone who may not have had the opportunity to have their gender markers changed or their name changed, and you are a healthcare provider or a social services provider, and you actually have to engage with their legal documentation. There are delicate ways to navigate that, rather than just being like, hey, Sarah, and this, and saying all these things. Rather than asking for those things by name, you can say, hey, can you tell me rather than being like, what's your real name, right? For a trans person, you can say, what's the name that's on your ID? What's the name that's on your insurance card? Or you can have conversations with that individual, especially if you're advocating for them for housing or social services, having a conversation ahead of time before you go into those meetings and be like, how do you want me to refer to you in these meetings? They do have these documents, they have these legal documents. Would you like me to check in with them ahead of time and let them know that your name is this, not these are the pronouns to choose? Or is that something you don't feel comfortable sharing? Because some people, again, will closet themselves in order to comfortably engage. And you just have to be there to hold them through that afterwards, because that's their choice if they need to closet themselves for their own safety. That's just something that they've chosen to do. Don't out people. This person's face on the left really freaks me out every time. I heard about you, it's really, really harmful, because individuals that you're engaging with may choose to come out to you, right? They may not have at the very beginning. Even if you're collecting SOGI data, they may have chosen to hide who they are. And that's fine, because SOGI data can always be updated. That's what's beautiful about it. But finally, after your demonstrated commitment to being inclusive, they look at you and they're like, you know what, sis, I'm a trans woman. My pronouns are she, her. This is my name. That's a beautiful moment, because you have forged a place of trust in a world that has taught that person that they cannot trust anyone. So there is a moment there that you can celebrate, like, oh my gosh, I'm doing something right. But then for you to go and then, trample over that trust and be like, oh my God, everyone, this person is trans, and like just going around, like you need to let that person come to that. You can ask, is that something you want me to share? Is that something you want to keep between me? Do you want me to only use the correct pronouns when we're in private or in front of others? Like, you have those authentic conversations with those individuals. Everyone is going to want something different. And then don't invade. This is the most disgusting. I can't even imagine someone like asking me about what's in my pants, right? It's just disgusting. So asking people about what surgeries they've had performed, what gender affirming procedures they've had, it is violent, disgusting, and yet only continues to perpetuate what happens from birth that doctors are doing when they look at someone's body. And, for trans people to go through certain procedures, it is not easy. It is not, like, certain surgeries are extremely taxing on their bodies to go through, but society, they need, in order to be affirmed in who they are, this is what they've chosen. So it is extremely violent to snoop through that and lift through the veneer and try and for what? It's not a zoo. It's not a circus. It's not your right at all to ask these questions. And really, I would love for us to live in a world where the body that you're born with is just the body that you're born with, and your gender identity can be, but that's not how society is, right? Society forces all these things. That's why people then are like, you know what? If this is how society is going to force me to feel about this body, then these are the things I'm going to do to affirm myself. And that's exactly what they should do. So don't invade. It's disgusting. It's really violent. And do correct your mistakes. If you accidentally misgender someone, especially when you're in front of other people, you say I meant he. He and I play chess on Mondays. Do that in front of that other person that you just misgendered them, and when you're talking with other people, because the correction, one, is the right thing to do, but then you corrected yourself in front of the other individual you're talking with who's not the trans person. So then that models for them how they should then engage with that person's gender identity. And of course, like I said, do respect your privacy. And last but not least, do keep learning. The work does not stop today. This is 101. This is elementary. I could teach this to 5-year-olds. I really could. This is elementary stuff that children could process. So you don't get to pat yourself on the back today and be like, I am competent in all things LGBTQ. Nope. This is just the beginning. There's a lifetime commitment that each of you must engage with if you really are here for the liberation of all people. So I'm going to stop there because I'm sure there's questions, there's feelings, criticism. You can tell me whatever you want. So I want to open that up. If there's any questions, I see Laura, thank you for the applause. I appreciate that. If there's anyone here that does have a question, please unmute yourself. You can type it. Comments, stories, maybe you have.
I would like to make a comment. You're fantastic. Thank you so much for all this valuable information you passed on today. I really appreciate the way you broke it down by generational context for everybody to understand when they're working with these older adults, where they came from in context, their experience. So I really appreciate all that you've done. I am going to pause the recording right now for questions so that people feel comfortable. 1 second. Okay, so I just wanted to thank everybody for participating in this training today. For those of you who are watching this recorded version of the training, I'd like to let you know that you can email lgbtq@avenidas.org for more information and to get any of your questions answered via email. You can reach Ephraim if you'd like to reach Ephraim personally. His email is E as in Ephraim, GETAHUN@OpenHouseSF.org. Before I let everybody go, I did mention there was one last poll to do. Let me pull that up and ask that you do that poll. You know what? I have to apologize because I am an older adult and I don't know how to pull up the second poll. It keeps pulling up the first poll. So I will email everybody
If
those
you have a
questions.
question, we could put it in the chat, Thomas.
Oh, okay. How about, okay, cool. Well, okay. And then I can save the chat. Oh, actually, no, it won't even let me pull up the poll to read the questions to you. So I apologize. I will, though, email each and every one of you.
Thomas,
Yeah.
is it, did you indicate it as an exit poll when you designed it? Usually I think it's after, I'm pretty sure it's after the meeting's over. Once you've ended it, I think it pops up. I might be wrong, but
Okay.
I think the polls, that's how it's designed.
Okay. Okay. Well, after the meeting is up, if it shows up, please take the poll. If not, though, I'm emailing each one of you a thank you email along with the link to this recorded training so that you can share it with other coworkers and people who you think would find this valuable and beneficial to their work. And that's our show for you today. So I would like to, again, thank you all for joining us. I hope that you guys got a lot out of it today. I hope you guys got a better understanding of what it means to be an LGBTQ older adult and a better understanding of how to care for them. And if you have any questions, again, you can reach us at lgbtq@avenidas.org. Thank you very much, folks. You guys have a great day.